It's a huge pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Willie McLeod from CORE to the podcast again. This is the third in a series around Can We Still Believe the Bible? And what we will be covering today is a scientific perspective. Willie, I really look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Willie, for being here again. I would like to start off the conversation with a question. You know, many times people will say, we cannot trust the Bible anymore because it was written centuries ago, and it is kind of as if people want to say it was in a pre-scientific age. Willie, how will you address something like that?
It's a pleasure to be with you again. Yeah, that is something that I have also heard some scholars, current scholars in South Africa, has actually mentioned that as a problem. And in their opinion, it disqualifies the Bible to be taken seriously in our day and age. Now, it's definitely true that the Bible comes from a very different world. We've talked about that previously. The world from which the Bible originated was very, very different from our current scientific perspective. But the question is whether that disqualifies the Bible as a reliable source about, say, history or the experience, the spiritual experience that they describe in the Bible. That's the question. Now, I think when one approaches this question, one should have first to ask, what is science? How did science change things? Now, what is interesting about science is that often people who are not scientists has this very, very high regard for science. And they believe science stands totally apart from our practical daily lives. It's some endeavor that's done in a laboratory, you know, it's something that's really special. But what is science? I think the Kantian philosopher, or the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, has described it quite well in his philosophy. So what he has shown is that science is just a systematization of experience. So in science, we just systemize our experience. So it's just taking human experience as the basis and then systemizing it through instruments, etc., in the framework of experiments. So if experience is the basis for science, then experience is typical of our human endeavor. It's very much part of our human condition to experience things. Yeah. And through all the ages, humans have experienced things in the same way. So the way that people in the pre-scientific age experience things and the way that we experience things are exactly the same. So if they describe things, and in many places in the Bible we read that the author would say that he refers to eyewitness accounts, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, there are other places also. Their experiences and what they observed in that period and in that time is exactly the same in the way that we experience and observe. So the way that they have given us these testimonies, we can trust them because nothing has changed in this regard. Science doesn't affect the way that we experience the world. What is maybe different is that those people would have held maybe a different worldview. But how does that influence our experience of things?
Well, Willie, I want to interrupt you there because it's literally, you've got two opposing worldviews. The one is what scientists will regard as of certain people as the primitive worldview, and then we have the modern worldview, and it's almost like never the twain shall meet. Whereas if you look at it from an experienced point of view, that's where it meets up. But I interrupted you. I also wanted to ask somewhere in the conversation if you can bring up the cosmic egg and have a bit of a conversation around that as well.
Yeah, so just to come back to the point, and you're 100% correct, it was a very different worldview. But the point of the matter is today, many Christians and people from other religions held in a certain way to that same worldview. They, in a certain sense, reconcile their scientific worldview with the ancient worldview that we find in the Bible. They bring it together. So when someone, for example, testifies in the court of law, he's called as a witness, and he holds a certain, let's say he's a very devout Christian, or maybe he's a Buddhist. He has a certain way of understanding the world, which is not the scientific perspective. He's not a scientist at all or so. But he describes, or she describes, what she has seen. Will the court say, okay, no, your worldview is not acceptable, therefore we can't accept your testimony?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Yes.
But we do it with the biblical testimonies. And that's the problem, you see. We're not consistent in our thinking. This is just not correct. Yeah.
Willie, when I read your article about the science and the trustworthiness of the Bible, it seems that the science has limitations as well. And, you know, today I hear in the news and people say, if it's not scientifically proven, I cannot believe it. So where do you think science has their limits as well?
Yeah, so this is a very important point. I think we've also discussed it the previous time when we talked about archaeology. It's the problem with the human condition is that we are very restricted in our understanding of things as well as our experience of things. We can only experience certain things. And we can talk about in this way of empirical access. We have a certain empirical access towards the world. Now, the question is, the world that we know, is it only a material world, which can, in every aspect, be accessed empirically? Now, there was a stage long ago, before quantum physics, where scientists believed that this world is material and that only that which is empirically accessible is real. The rest just don't exist. They took science as the measure of all things, and they believed very seriously, in the same way that they believed at that stage that the sun is the center of, was the center of, or is the center of the universe. It's absolutely not a valid way of thinking, but in that time, about 100 or so years ago, that was their belief system. They believed that the world is just material. Now, the interesting thing about quantum physics is it has changed everything.
Yep.
In quantum physics, when the particle, before the particle is measured, the pre-measurement phase, that's what we call it, and it's in a superposition of states. In the mathematical description of the particle is not in our space. It's not in our proper space. And when we extend the theory a little bit to quantum field theory, then the particle is not even in time. It's not in space or time. Now, things have to be in space and time for us to observe them empirically. So in quantum physics, this is very basic to quantum physics. We cannot observe, empirically access the particle in its pre-measurement phase during this period when it's in a superposition of states. We cannot. When we measure it, it immediately changes its behavior in a certain sense, and it becomes materialized in real time and space. And that's not the same that it was before we measured it, when it was in the pre-measurement phase in a superposition of states. In some way, philosophers of science has discussed this quite a lot of times. I've written an extended article, about 100 pages, a monograph that had been published about this. And the problem is just, where is this space, this mathematical space that we're talking about? Nobody knows where this particle is. It's definitely not in our space. So what we find in physics is we had been confronted with the fact that the world is not just material. There are aspects of our world, it's obviously real, but it's not material, and it's not empirically accessible. That's why we, for example, talk about dark matter, dark energy, etc., etc. But there are large realms, actually, in some projections, about 93% of our world is not empirically accessible, directly empirically accessible. So we have to do all sorts of strange maneuvers to try and understand something about this quantum realm, which is beyond empirical access. So now suddenly we know the world is not material. So when Christians says that we believe in a world beyond the material world, 100 years ago, it was a very strange thing to say, because most scientists of that age, in that Enlightenment period, just say, all that we know in physics is the material world. And you guys, you believe in a non-material world, a world beyond the material world. What nonsense is this? But in our day and age, with quantum physics, we know the world is not material. Large parts of the world is not material. Yeah. What is that world like? We know very little about it.
Willie, if I can just jump in here, if someone tells you or asks you as a scientist, and you're a scientist, you read the Bible, you're a Christian, in what ways do science support the trustworthiness of the Bible?
Yeah, so from a scientific perspective, when we look at the Bible, the first question is whether the Bible is in contrast or in conflict with science. So is the Bible in conflict with science? I do not believe so. Now, there are many aspects to discuss, from creation to many other things. And the way that I read Scripture, I believe there's no conflict at all between science and between the way that I understand the Bible. In my view, the way that those people, those ancient people, experienced the world around them and the testimonies that had been written down about them, they wrote it down with integrity. The Bible states that quite clearly. They were holy men of God. We can believe them when they say certain things happened. That's why I also believe in miracles. Miracles is not something that we can scientifically describe in terms of the laws of nature. It goes beyond that. But if we believe in God, then we can also believe in miracles, that He is greater than the material world. And because He is the creator of the material world, He can produce miracles in our world. So that's why I also believe in miracles. I believe in prophecy. The moment that you accept that the world is not just material, and you allow for the possibility of a spiritual world, for another, the ancients, even all around the world, even the Greeks, Plato, Socrates, they speak about the invisible world. They believed in the soul. Maybe the definition was maybe slightly different from the Judeo-Christian perspective, but nonetheless, they believed in the soul. And Plato would refer to the soul, which is situated in the invisible world. So these are all concepts. It's not just found in the Bible. And the interesting thing is this invisible world that Plato described, he actually got the idea from certain mystics, which believed themselves to have engaged with this invisible world. So Plato tells the story in his Republic, this well-known story about the cave. And he says that what we are actually persons. We are chained to a wall. We are like people chained to a wall. And we see certain things on the wall happening. And we think these are the real stuff happening before our eyes. But what we do not know is that these are only shadows. There's a light somewhere at the back, and the real stuff are behind us somewhere, and it moves behind the light, which throws shadows on the wall. So the real world, which in current science is described and accepted as the only real world, in these circles, scientism circles, I believe this is the only real world. So what Plato says here is that the real world, the really real world, is actually the invisible world. Because the world is not this material world. So this perspective were later reformulated by Immanuel Kant, and what he did is he described what he called a noumenal world. Now, noumena comes from the Greek word for mind, nous. So what he says is there's a noumenal, or as he also calls it in his third critique, the supersensible world. It's beyond our senses. So what Kant did in his philosophy of science in the third critique, let face it, it's in his philosophy of science. He produced the mathematical basis for empirical science. Kant. And in his philosophy of science in the third critique, he incorporated the supersensible realm, or what he said is our material world. Beyond our material world, there's a substratum, let's call it a substratum, which is supersensible. And he had certain characteristics of this world. Now, he got this idea from the invisible world of Plato. But he incorporated this concept in his philosophy of science. Now, I've shown in that article, that monograph, it's actually quite an extensive study, published study, that all the characteristics of Kant's supersensible realm had been confirmed in the quantum realm. That's why the quantum realm is beyond empirical access. In that sense, it's supersensible in exactly the same way that Kant describes it. So that's a lot of things to say. But when all these things are considered, and when science is looked upon from this perspective, then suddenly it seems that the Christian way of thinking, the longer time progressed, and in the progress of science, we have moved closer and closer and closer to the Christian perspective, and further away from the atheistic perspective of a century and a half ago.
Willie, you mentioned the word scientism. I almost want to say the cult of scientism. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Scientism. That's the people that believe that science is actually the measure of all things. So that's quite important. They believe this. Wilfred Salus, he was a philosopher. He was the one who first made this comment that science is the measure of all things. So they believe that only that which is empirically attested to can be accepted as real. So they take the view that only the empirical is real. Now, I've already shown that this is just plain wrong, but they furthermore believe that only what can be shown in science can be believed. But the problem is science progress. And what was believed 100 or 150 years ago, the scientific field has changed dramatically. And I can tell you it's going to change dramatically in the next 100 years. So we can't take the science of today or of yesterday as a measure, because science is changing in the progress of science. And I can just mention a few things. You know, most people are used to the concept of the Big Bang. What they do not know is that 100, 150 years ago, all the scientists, or it was a general view of the scientific community, that the world is static and there was no beginning to the cosmos. It was just always the same. That was the considered opinion. They seriously believed it. Then there was a Christian that proposed this model of the Big Bang. It's actually a Christian that proposed it. And when they did these studies, you know, and they found the redshift and other things and so on, and slowly but steadily, they observed that there are good testimony in support that the world had a beginning. And then from Einstein's equations came the Big Bang theory also, where mathematically the Big Bang is described by a singularity. So now suddenly the scientific community had a problem, because what they observed were much more in line with the Christian view that the world had a beginning, because the Christians had always said the world at the beginning, God created it. But the atheists said, no, the world is static. It was always the same. And then there were enormous discussion and debate, and many scientists just didn't want to move beyond the static model to the Big Bang model of the world having a beginning, because they believe it's too close to the Christian model. Yeah. That's the background. That's reality. You can go and read it. And I can take many other examples.
Yeah. Can we refer to God as the singularity? What are your thoughts around that?
No, I don't think so. It's just mathematically we can't describe the Big Bang. But as a Christian, I believe that the world having a beginning is consistent with God having created the cosmos and the world. So in that sense, I believe in that. So I think it's a good model, and it's consistent. I also believe with a good hermeneutical reading of the story of creation, etc. But that's not for today. But the point that I want to make is that science is not in conflict with the Bible. And the scientific worldview, the longer we proceed in the progress of science, the more and the more we find that science is consistent with the biblical way of understanding things. Let's take another point. Spontaneity. If we as humans are absolutely and totally determined, how on earth can we adhere to the moral law? It's just impossible. How can God require us to live up to the moral law if we don't have the ability, if we don't have that kind of freedom of the will? So to live up to the moral law, we need that kind of freedom of the will. Now, Immanuel Kant, when he was thinking about these things, he said, well, we can actually, as humans, we can formulate a law, any law. Let's say I'm going to fast for the next 40 days. And then we have the ability to keep to that law, even though we may die in the process. So we have the freedom of the will to do that. Now, how is it possible? So what Kant said, okay, let's assume there are spontaneity somewhere in some way in this cosmos, because if everything is determined and mechanistic, then free will and the ability to live up to the moral law is just totally impossible. So that's why he said the only place where he can place this spontaneity is in the supersensible realm. Now, when it comes to quantum physics, the most dramatic outcome of quantum physics is exactly this indeterminate aspect of quantum physics. It is absolutely indeterminate. Take, for example, the decay of a particle. It's just absolutely indeterminate to tell when a certain particle will decay. We can't do that. And there are many other things in quantum physics that I can refer to in this regard. Now, suddenly, spontaneity, or maybe, well, Bohr, for example, referred to spontaneity. Many scientists, you know, they, because of their atheistic inclination, they don't like the word spontaneity, so they would just keep the indeterminate. But the point of the matter, it works in exactly the same way. It doesn't matter which word you use for that. But it's consistent with the Christian way of thinking, the Christian worldview. And it's against the way that atheist has always seen the world. And that's why there's a large part of the scientific community that always tries in every possible way to try and adhere to a deterministic world. But we're beyond that point. We've shown that determinism breaks down in quantum physics, and there's no question about it.
Willie, in the scientific world, why do you think, or maybe not even in the scientific world, but for many people, they read the Bible, or they don't even want to read the Bible, they just say it's not true. How can we approach a conversation with someone who says, you know what, the Bible is ancient, it's not true, it's not scientific? Where can we start that conversation, you think?
Well, it's a wide topic. And it's also dependent on our perspective. We have a certain field of knowledge. And if we're not scientists, maybe it's slightly more difficult to incorporate scientific concepts and, have this kind of discussion. So it depends, I think, from person to person. So if we're talking with somebody, it depends on that person's perspective, these type of questions. But one of the things that I've seen on Facebook in a certain group, I belong to many groups. In one group, the question was posted, why don't you believe in God? And for the most part, people on that particular group are aware atheists. And I was amazed to see the answers. Most of them says, it's because we cannot empirically show that God exists. So they need empirical evidence for the existence of God. So they do not understand the most basic aspect of science, that God is beyond empirical reach. In the same way, well, maybe not in the same way, but comparable, or we can use quantum physics or the pre-measurement phase in quantum physics to try and understand the fact that according to the Bible, God is beyond the empirical. So if God is beyond the empirical, how on earth can we require empirical evidence for God's existence? So I think this is a very good point. Now let me compare this with the Big Bang. Scientists in general believe in the Big Bang. But now here is the interesting point. They believe that the world as we know it has come about through the Big Bang. There are some other theories. I'm not now so much interested in all those details because it's not so important to this conversation. The point of the matter is the Big Bang is beyond empirical reach. It's extremely important and very simple. It's absolutely and totally impossible to ever bring the Big Bang within empirical reach. So there's no way that we can ever empirically show that the Big Bang exists, or empirically engage with Big Bang. It's just totally impossible. So in the same way, God is beyond space and time and is beyond empirical reach. So if we allow the Big Bang, which is beyond empirical reach, and we can only bring some very indirect evidence in support of this model, why can't we believe in God, which is beyond empirical reach, but as creator has given us a lot to believe that he exists? Indirect, obviously, in the same way that we would evaluate the Big Bang, evaluate indirect evidence. For example, next time we'll be talking about prophecy, the remarkable way in which prophecy had been fulfilled. Well, it's very interesting. And many other things, the consistency of, we've spoken about it last time, the previous time, how the Bible has been shown to be consistent with the evidence. No evidence has ever been brought forward which is in contrast and against the biblical narrative. Now, I must say, when I say the biblical narrative, I'm talking about the sophisticated narrative, because there are many narratives, biblical narratives. Some of them are not that sophisticated and are totally against science. I do not think they are good narratives. I don't believe they are based on good hermeneutics, etc., etc. So when we have a good biblical narrative, then it's consistent with history, it's consistent with archaeology, consistent with science. It's a good, powerful narrative. We can believe it.
Willie, so I want to ask the big question. If something like the Big Bang we cannot look at from an empirical point of view, and God applies to that as well, but atheists will look at the Big Bang as something that is sort of fixed in their minds as something that happened. Why do you think they reject the concept of God? What's the resistance? What's that wall that keeps them away from belief?
I think one of the reasons are, we are all in a certain sense programmed. We're conditioned in a certain way. We've talked about it previously.
Yes.
When you are a scholar, you go to university as a student. As a student, you have many perspectives, ideas, etc., but you are molded. At university, they mold you into a certain fixed form, a scientific mold. You can only think in these terms. This is how the discipline works, etc., etc., etc. So for most people, scientifically speaking, the Big Bang, they're so used to the term. It's so well accepted in the community. It's not questioned. But they have not thought about these things really in a clear sense, and understand that the Big Bang is beyond space and time. It's not it's the beginning. It's a singularity. We cannot empirically access it. In the same way, God, we cannot empirically access God. It's so simple. Why do we require empirical evidence, direct evidence for God's existence? What we only allow indirect, very indirect evidence, empirical evidence. But we do believe in the Big Bang. It's because the scientists are absolutely conditioned in this way of thinking. So I think what we as Christians in our discussions, we have spoken about dialogistics, having these kind of discussions. If we have a clear understanding of our own faith and how these things work, it's much easier to convince other people in their discussion, to show them why it's not that absurd to believe in God, because God, we have every reason to believe in God. Yeah.
On this wonderful note, I think, Lebay, we need to wrap it up. I don't know if you have a last thought, but I do have something that I want to conclude with, but I give it to you, Lebay.
Yes, I have one. Willie, one of in the article, when I read through that, you bring up the whole concept around the cosmic egg, and it was just such a beautiful explanation and of how in biblical times they viewed the world. Would you mind, just for the listeners, explain what the cosmic egg is?
Yeah, Lebay, this is actually quite an extended topic, and to explain it in a sufficient way, good enough that people would really understand.
Perhaps another podcast.
Yeah, we will need a more in-depth discussion on that. So I'm not sure whether it's wise now to.
Perfect.
That's a lot, but I think I should go and read the article. It's there, and I explain it there in rather simple terms. So I think they can read it. But I hope you're happy with my answer. Otherwise, I can try to do
No,
it.
absolutely. Do you know what? I think that leaves some room for another podcast. I did post the article on the Facebook page as well, so people can go and read up on it. And the previous two articles have also been posted. But let's park that for a bit, and then somewhere down the line we can review.
Well, you just help us now to go to read the article, Lebay. So we need to do that. But Willie, I just want to say thank you. I'm very encouraged knowing that we talked to a scholar with your stature. You're a PhD, you're a scientist, and you believe in the Bible. That is a huge encouragement. That it reminds me of a beautiful verse in the Bible that I want to conclude with. Actually, maybe more than one. Colossians 1:15. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And that is just amazing that the God of the Bible made himself visible to us, that we know God's character. And then on your website, Willie, you have that beautiful passage of Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. So, Willie, thank you so much. I'm very encouraged. I've learned a lot, and I'm going to read the Bible with new excitement. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It will be great if you can just subscribe to the YouTube videos, and then you will get the notification when we post our next videos. Thank you so much.